Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm chief economist at American Compass. And this week we are joined by Professor Joshua Kleinfeld, until recently a professor of law at Northwestern, now at the Scalia School of Law at George Mason, and a real leader in the conservative legal movement, and particularly in its intersection with the new right and a lot of the interesting thinking going on in conservatism generally, in conservative economics. He really connects the dots to how that affects conservative legal thought, what it means to worry as much about private power as about public power, how that is playing out in debates within the Federalist Society. And then we also get into a fascinating conversation about his most recent project on what's formally called demony voting, or more casually called letting parents vote for their kids, which is obviously an issue that has been of increasing interest on the right. You will see I'm somewhat skeptical myself, but he makes a fascinating case, and I think it really moves the ball forward in that discussion. So stick around for that. But before you get to listen to that, you have to listen to me tell you about everything else we're doing at American Compass this week. A lot of good stuff on the Commons. John Seiler, congratulations to him on joining the Manhattan Institute, where he's now Director of Higher Education Policy. Has a great piece out on the politicization of federal grants called Science Policy Can't Be Driven by Advocates. Got a couple of other pieces coming later this week, one by Sam Pressler on the need for more communal pathways to navigate the adulthood transition, and one from Micah Meadowcroft on thinking about foreign policy in Asia beyond just the China challenge. So keep an eye out for those. And then finally, hope if somehow you're not already subscribed to my wonderful Substack, Understanding America, you will head over and do that. We have exciting progress this week. You can now reach it directly at understandingamerica.co. So go ahead and type that into your browser, subscribe, and in the meantime, enjoy this conversation with Joshua Kleinfeld. Josh Kleinfeld, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks you, Oren. I'm really glad to be here.
So I've gotten to know Professor Kleinfeld over the past year, been fascinated by the work you're doing. And I think, particularly in the legal conservative movement, there is, or is it the conservative legal movement? I don't, one or the other. Both are acceptable. There's been, I think, some really interesting ferment in parallel to everything else that's going on in politics on the right of center and economics. And you are right at the center of it. And so would love to start by just sort of asking you the broad question: well, what are you interested in? What are you working on these days?
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here. Really glad for the invitation. Uh, the central question for me these days is whether the ideals of democracy are realized in practice. And as the question suggests, I think they're often not realized in practice in the United States or elsewhere. So if your vision of democracy is that the public, our shared public world is governed by majoritarian convictions, that we basically see the views of we the people reflected in our law and in the operation of our state and public institutions, with, to be sure, a private sphere that's sacrosanct, that's a matter of individual rights. Um, we would expect a concordance of people's, widespread, stable majority convictions and the law and the behavior of our public institutions. And you just don't see it. You don't see it in the United States, and you don't see it elsewhere. And so that anomaly has just come to be fascinating to me and disturbing, and I'm analyzing it from different perspectives. So I look at it in constitutional law, I look at it in statutory law, what we call legislation, and I look at it in criminal law as well, actually. One of the things that really interests me in the field I started in, which was criminal law, is how our criminal law just doesn't reflect very well what most people think ought to be punished.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was going to say, what are some concrete examples? Because the one that comes to mind immediately for me is immigration, just because it's become so salient in populist movements throughout the Western world. What else would you put on that list? Say a little bit more about the criminal law situation, or some others
Sure,
that
just
you
any
think are really
examples to
important.
put some meat on the bones. Yeah. Immigration, by the way, is an interesting example. There are these, basically, our policy about immigration has been much, much more permissive than most Americans want to be. And that's been true for decades. And it's been true largely in both parties. And it's been true largely despite the law. So the actual law that Congress wrote about immigration would imply much less immigration and much more deportation. And presidents just haven't enforced it consistently. But there are other examples as well. Probably the most vivid for me is affirmative action. Affirmative action has been pulled every way since Sunday, thousands of polls, and quite consistently, stable supermajorities of the country disapprove of it. They think it's wrong as a matter of justice to prefer people based on race or other identity characteristics, and they think it's wrong even when it's intended for sort of benevolent purposes. They just think it's wrong to take that into account when you decide who gets into a university, for example, or who gets a partnership at a law firm, or whatever the situation may be. And yet essentially every institution, every major institution, whether it's a for-profit business or a not-for-profit university, or indeed the government itself, practices affirmative action, notwithstanding the fact that stable supermajorities of the people disagree with it and disapprove of it. Or take, I mean, here's a really modest example from criminal law. You turn on a movie and there's an FBI warning, and the FBI warning says the unauthorized reproduction or public showing of this movie is, I think it says a 5-year felony. I'd have to actually double check the
Is this still true on streaming? This sounds like something that happens after I go to Blockbuster and rent my video.
I guess I don't see it when I stream something on Netflix, but
But your point is
traditionally
well
you
taken. We have to tell all of our young Zoomer listeners. So it used to be you put the movie cassette into the VCR and you hit play, and the first thing that came up was this ugly blue screen with an FBI warning that, as you said, it's a 5-year felony if I don't know, if you copy the video or show it in the wrong place or something.
show it to the public, essentially, not just for profit, but show it to the public without authorization, without paying. And indeed, anytime you do so, it's a 5-year felony. It's a count of a 5-year felony. So if you do it 3 times, that's a 15-year sentence potentially. I don't think any Americans believe that it would be just to give someone who invades copyright in that way a 15-year sentence. That's just totally out of accord with how people actually live their lives. Or here's another example. In my old office in Chicago, it looked out on Lakeshore Drive, which was an 8-lane highway with a divider that was the major north-south artery of Chicago. And naturally, on an 8-lane highway with a divider, people go, 60 miles an hour, 65 miles an hour. Along its entire posted length, the speed limit was 40 miles an hour, which meant that if you're speeding by, I think, 20 miles or more, it's not just a violation, it's a misdemeanor. So essentially, every driver is a misdemeanor. How do we end up with law that is this inconsistent with ordinary social practice? And I think that's a disease in America, and I'm trying to figure out I'm trying to diagnose it and cure it.
Well, and the interesting thing about those examples is, I'm curious what you think, but I suspect they have different explanations in some sense. I mean, we could add, thinking about kind of more progressive critiques also, there tends to be a whole set of issues that are attributed to sort of what the wealthy or powerful or, donors want to achieve. What you've described, seems very kind of socially and culturally inflected. Some, I honestly, I have no idea why would the speed limit
Mhm.
speed limit be 40 instead of 60, or why is it a 5-year felony? So what are the explanations in your mind? Is there a grand unified theory, or are they different types of problems?
Well, it's not simple, and it probably defies the attempt at a grand unified theory. What the empirics show, there's actually political scientists who have studied this, and the empirics show that uh, American policy is incredibly responsive to the top 10% of the country in terms of earning, and institutional forces in the country. For example, very responsive educational policy is very responsive to what universities collectively want, or what um, financial policy is very responsive to what banks collectively want. It is true that some political scientists, themselves um, progressive Democrats, characterize this as oligarchy because they note the correlation of wealth and power with influence over the American economy. I don't think that's entirely wrong, and I don't think it's entirely right. Um, Traditional oligarchies look like Russia or the Philippines. You have a handful of billionaire oligarchs, or in the Philippines, powerful families that dominate provinces. And the oligarchy consists not of 10% of the population or 5% of the population. And it doesn't consist in institutions, it consists of 10, 20, 30 individuals or families. That's a traditional meaning of oligarchy. What we're really seeing is something more like class domination. 5 or 10% of earning just correlates with the people who have a lot of education and basically form the professional classes. Those same people run institutions. So their joint responsiveness of American policy to the views and values of the top 10% and of the institutions that the top 10% manage is actually the same thing. It means that there's a domination of a social class. I think that's distinct from oligarchy. I'm sympathetic to those who think it falls under the category of oligarchy.
Yeah, and so I guess this is, in a sense, a common thread running through these disconnects are essentially that they are disconnects between what that professional class, or even when it comes to copyright law, the very small subset of the professional class that earns its money making movies wants, as contrasted with what essentially everybody else wants. Is it fair to think of this as sort of a form of the kind of, diffuse interest versus concentrated interest critique that you always hear? I mean, there's a way that you could say, well, basically you're describing the professional class as like a special interest group that dominates in the things it really cares about. But even as I say it, that strikes me as not quite right. It seems to me this is a slightly different problem than just, oh well, you have lobbyists who are going to lobby for their
Yeah.
priorities.
So I agree with you. My intuition is the same, a related but not quite identical problem. Now, they might overlap in some respects. For example, the copyright felonies may really be sort of the joint product of the movie industry, or generally the copyright holder industry, which includes book publishers and the like. Um, a sort of joint partnership with prosecutors who have constitute a special interest group when it comes to criminal law and have enormous influence over making criminal law very, very harsh, essentially for leverage and plea bargaining. Because they don't have to sentence people to 15 years. What they do is
Right.
they threaten 15 years and they offer 1 year and people take the deal. So that's great leverage if you want a conviction. That's the old special interest kind of critique. I think the broad class domination, the fact that there are things that Americans believe with respect to gun control or abortion or the social safety net or immigration or affirmative action. By the way, the things about which you see stable supermajorities are bipartisan. You see them on both, you see stable supermajorities on both the right and the left as we define them in this country. And what they have in common is they cannot prevail in public policy, notwithstanding the fact that they come from both parties and are stable supermajorities. There, I think it's really not about diffuse versus concentrated interests. It's about class power.
Right. And so I think this connects, although I'm curious how in your mind it connects to the other theme you sort of brought up initially, which is private versus public sphere, kind
Mm,
of, market versus democratic control. On one hand, it seemed you were indicating what we need essentially is more democratic control versus, that essentially the public sphere subject to public control is relatively broad. Conversely, you're describing a system of democratic control that dysfunctions wildly. So say a little bit more about this issue of public and private spheres and control, and then we can connect it back to the is the system working or not.
when traditionally when people talk about the private and the public sphere, what they mean by public sphere is the government, the state, and what they mean by the private sphere is everything else. I just think that's fundamentally confused. That's wrong, right? The public sphere is where we live out our collective lives together. It's where we plan so the private sphere is the individual, the family, it's small scale life and associations. And that really is a domain of rights where we should be trying to pursue liberty to the extent your liberty is compatible with mine. But to extend that to, Google, to Facebook, to Disney, I think that's a grave mistake. I think those institutions they are our public life. I mean, where do we live out our collective life together? We live them out in the universities we attend, and the employment we pursue, and the media we consume. And if you put all of those things as a matter of sort of ideological principle, if you say they're all um, sacrosanct, protected against the influence of the state, including a democratic state, then what you're really saying is that we, the people, the democratic people, can't control the shape of our public life together. So I tend to part ways with other people in the conservative movement or libertarian movement or just the right generally, who think that only the state threatens liberty. And it almost by definition, to limit the state is to expand the sphere of liberty. And therefore, the market in particular is sacrosanct. Sort of the invisible hand can do no wrong. I just think those views aren't necessarily true. It's sometimes the case that the state is the great invader of liberty, and that needs to be, we need to control it by means of constitutional law, for example. In other social situations, it might be private corporations that are invading human liberty, and we need to control them. That's what the Civil Rights Act did, right? It said businesses can no longer, places of public accommodation can no longer discriminate against people on the basis of race and other identity characteristics. That was a win for freedom, not a loss. So I think the conservative movement broadly and the conservative legal movement in particular took a wrong turn in its fixation on the state and its lack of attention to how markets don't consistently or necessarily expand freedom.
And so, what is the state of those debates? I mean, I think you're someone who's very active in the Federalist Society. I know there have been high profile public debates that clearly are going on. How would you characterize the disagreement? I think our listeners are very familiar with the tooth and nail fights over trade and tariffs, let's say on the
Yeah.
economic side. Where's the rubber meeting the road? What is the constellation of forces on the legal side?
If I had one word to characterize the debate these days, it would be vigorous. It is, um, and it's something I really honor about the movement, about the Federalist Society in particular, is instead of trying to suppress these debates, they are airing them, and it's fascinating. I'll give some examples.
Yeah.
Recently, I was at the Federalist Society National Lawyers Convention, which is probably the biggest event of the year in the conservative legal movement. And the luncheon debate, which is the sort of climax of this big conference, was the resolution was resolved. Private power is a greater threat to liberty than state power, and the it was a debate, so there was a pro and a con side. The pro side was a 40-something-year-old conservative plaintiff's lawyer. Uh, just think about that very category for a moment. When we were kids, there weren't conservative plaintiffs lawyers. Now there are. He was engaged in suing companies who he thought were encroaching on human liberty. And he made the case that these private entities are abusive and are behaving in ways that should be constrained by the state. On the other side was a former bank CEO um, and head of a nonprofit who are saying no, the state and only the state is the big invader of human liberty. And to the extent you pull the state back from market regulation, that's a good thing. Well, the two of them went at it. It was respectful, but it was an extremely passionate debate on both sides. And it was fascinating to watch the crowd because you looked around, and when the plaintiff's lawyer spoke, every black or brown haired head in the crowd seemed to be nodding. And when the former bank CEO spoke, every white haired or bald haired head seemed to be nodding. It was a generational conflict to some extent, although albeit with exceptions. Another example, and again, by the way, that debate does such honor to the Federalist Society, just that they would host both sides of that debate and let it be aired, let it be had. Um, at a still more recent National Lawyers Convention hosted by the Federalist Society, the guest of honor was Lena Khan, right? President Biden's FTC chair. famous for her crusading against corporations. Well, she was invited to the Federalist Society debate, excuse me, Federalist Society convention to speak to the crowd. And I saw large groups of people who were sort of flabbergasted that she was there. And that very day that she appeared, the Wall Street Journal published what I believe was its 70th editorial denouncing her, right? So that's one side of the debate. But I also watched as a group of Federalist Society students, sort of leadership of Federalist Society chapters, um, uh, cheered for her like she was Teddy Roosevelt, like she was their personal hero. So there is a debate unfolding in conservative circles. As you've noted, I'm involved in that debate. I'm only one person involved in that debate. The conservative legal movement, I think the conservative movement more broadly, is seriously intellectually engaged about really about how to conceive of threats to a constitutional democracy and a liberal society. So a lot of people who really care about human liberty but disagree about how it's threatened and how to realize it.
Yeah, the generational point is one I see constantly in all the dimensions of this fight, and I always emphasize and find myself trying to explain this to journalists actually a lot, that the people that they are used to interviewing to represent the right of center are people who grew up with Reagan, and their frame of reference is the Cold War. And there's this very sharp cutoff around people who are in their early 40s of, do you remember Reagan, or is Reagan somebody you read about? And do you remember the fall of the Berlin Wall, or is that something you see grainy video clips of? And for everybody in that younger generation, that just as millennials are becoming kind of the center, that's really who we're talking about, as they become the bulk of the up and coming conservative movement in all its dimensions. You have a group that doesn't think of the massive threats and debates as communism, as the McGovern Mondale style liberal Democrats, but people who have seen what has gone wrong in the country over the past 25 to 30 years, and for whom some of these abuses of power, by exactly as you said, we would call them private in the traditional sense, but acting in an incredibly public capacity, are in fact the ones causing a lot of the
Yeah.
problems in ways that seem very incompatible with liberty. And so I guess I want to connect it back to what you started with, which was this point of sort of how our democratic and decision making structures are themselves dysfunctional, because one might say, okay, well, we need therefore more of democratic power exerting itself in these contexts. The problem to some extent is that if that power is itself not representative of what people want, you more sort of have a collusion among a the wrong public and private actors. And so it becomes sort of a very fundamental structural problem. Um, what do we do with that? How do you sort of get concrete on, okay, here is where the structure is flawed, and what sorts of things do you think about as the kinds of responses we have to grapple with?
Yeah, if I could just start by commenting on your point about generational
Yeah.
division, because I'm in that 40 something year old category, and I feel like I've seen both sides of it. Um, I remember my first political memory is the Berlin Wall falling and watching my parents cheer as they had on the TV this scene of Germans who themselves were cheering over the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'd never seen grown-ups that excited before. And I sort of, wondered what it meant for my parents, for my father in particular, who is a very much a sort of Reaganite conservative. Um, uh, the singular defining incident was, or defining experience was the Soviet Union, where private property was in the hands of the state, and the state directed all affairs, and it was incredibly oppressive. And the alternative was this small state, market driven, pro liberty vision that really Milton Friedman was the intellectual architect of, more perhaps than anyone else. And uh, it it sort of formed a world in which you restrain the state and thereby expand human prosperity and liberty. For the next generation, the formative experiences were the culture wars, and seeing many of their values, um, it, seeing institutions, both public and private, behaving in ways that were repugnant to their values. And today, for my students, for example, many of the conservative law students I teach are terrified of being outed as conservatives in their law firms. The law firms are private. They think they'll be fired or passed over for work or passed over for partnership, and they feel totally unfree. Of course, they feel unfree, right? They can't be an expressed version of themselves at work for fear that their views will make them um, make them uh, unhirable or unpromotable. And who's oppressing their freedom in that context? Well, it's a private institutional actor acting on an ideological basis. And if anything, they would like legal protection. They'd like their views to be sufficiently protected that they can't be fired on that basis. So all of that is, I guess, just to give an exclamation mark to what you said before, that these are about different generational experiences. That said, I like to think that there's a way of taking on board the wisdom of the Cold War experience and the wisdom of the culture war experience and being just enlightened about the cause of democratic governance and human freedom, and not just sort of bobbing with the current of American problems. And I think what we've learned is that the question of what is really a threat to a democratic society and a liberal society, both halves of the liberty democracy equation. The question of what's a threat to it is an empirical question. It has to do with the times in which you live. And the solution to it is not one that follows from first principles of philosophy. Um, it's a judgment about what legal arrangements best secure democracy and liberty in one's own time.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it's funny, the prudentialism in and of itself is such a core kind of conservative principle that I feel like was lost to some extent in an era where, a little bit to your point about the sort of Milton Friedman on one side and, communists on the other side, everyone got very comfortable in very absolute
Right.
principles, which frankly to some extent are appropriate when you're fighting the Cold War. But I think a core part of what, especially in contrast with how progressives tend to approach a lot of issues, a core part of what conservatives have historically been good at and need to once more be good at is bringing that much more prudential, pragmatic lens to, as Burke said, I won't, I'll paraphrase it. Everything is a matter of circumstance, and actual statesmanship is realizing that and trying to figure out the actual problem and recognize the limits of human nature and government and still see what can be done. Um, so
I
what can be
agree with
done?
you completely. The dogmatism and the absolutism of some people in our sort of category here is really disturbing. In a way, it's completely contrary to the conservative worldview.
Yeah, I think
Okay,
that's right.
as
So
to the
what can be
what to be
done?
done problem, I think conservatives need to start thinking creatively about policy. And there is no silver bullet policy, but we need to start thinking creatively about what can be done uh, with the different instruments of state power, with governor's offices or state legislatures, um, uh, with executive orders, with the administrative state, with Congress, as many problems as it is beset by, with the courts. There's a tendency in conservative circles to sort of whine articulately about the things that are wrong with the culture, and then to somehow experience it as disreputable to propose policy solutions. Right? That is not to be done. We have satisfied ourselves with the whining, but no, we actually need to think about creative policy solutions. Um, so One idea I've proposed along this line, which I think we're going to get to later in the conversation, is the give parents the vote idea.
Yeah,
The
let's get to
basically,
that now. So this is
can we
a
get to that now? I
fascinating
have a few,
example.
but I'm
Yeah.
happy to talk about that one.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's I guess a forthcoming paper in Notre Dame Law Review called "Give Parents the Vote." It addresses this idea. I guess the technical term is demony voting. But I'll let you make the case.
Sure.
Where does this come from? Why are we talking about it?
I should say it's co-authored with Steve Sachs, who is a professor at Harvard Law School, and he's the most incredible co-author. Being next to him is like being next to a volcano intellectually, and I have to keep up. Um, a term we might use for it is parent proxy voting. The essential idea is that parents should be able to vote on behalf of their minor children. Um, uh, we extend it as well to the guardians of the mentally incapacitated. Their legal guardian should have the right to vote on behalf of their charges for many of the same reasons. Um, but I'll focus in our conversation on parent proxy voting just because children are so much more numerous. Children represent 23% of the citizenry, uh, and and have zero votes. So they are radically underrepresented and undercounted in any democratic decision making. And in terms of the argument for why proxy voting is desirable, I would say two things. First is there are real policy problems that, if you look closely at them, trace back to the fact that children have so little political power. The ways democracies, real democracies, basically function, much as we might wish it otherwise, is that politicians chase votes, and where there is voting power, politicians tend to be pretty responsive to those interests. And we see in situation after situation, kids' interests in conflict with some other segment of society, and kids losing in all of those political problems. So, to me, the most vivid and concentrated such example is the COVID school shutdowns. When COVID first hit, really no one knew how severe a health risk it would be, and it was natural enough to shut down the schools along with other social institutions. But even by the summer of 2020, and certainly by 2021, a few things had become clear that weren't clear before, scientifically clear. One is that children were much less likely to get infected, much less likely to get seriously sick if they were infected, and much less likely to affect others. So if there was any group that was at least risk from COVID, it was children. It had also become clear that school shutdowns were having terrible effects on children. They're not like us, right? They're not like you just work on your laptop from home. Kids need to be in a social environment, they need to be in a classroom environment, and they're in a maturation phase where the cost of 1 year, certainly the cost of 2 years, is quite massive to their development. It had also become clear that the effects of the COVID school shutdowns were worse for children than for worse for poor children, rather. Like as you um, uh, the worse the family was off socioeconomically, the more severe the uh,
Mhm.
the harm of the COVID school shutdowns were. And yet, as all those things became clear, schools stayed shut down. Bars opened up, great for 20 something people's Tinder social lives. Hotels opened up, restaurants opened up. There was a sort of judgment being made politically about who should have to bear the cost of the public health risk. We're going to open up some institutions, we're going to close others. Which institution should open? And every time that political calculus was made, children lost. Why did they lose? Overwhelmingly, it was because teachers' unions are very, very powerful, and non-parent interests were very powerful, and parents emphatically wanted schools opened up, but they only voted with their own power, and not with their children's power, so their votes could be discounted. Non-parents represent, or people who don't currently have minor children at home, represent about 50% of the citizenry, but they wield 75% of the votes. Parents and children represent the other 50%, approximate terms here, of the citizenry, but wield 25% of the votes. So that is a real concrete policy distortion that follows from parents and children in particular being so politically powerless. And it's not the only one, it's just the most obvious one.
Yeah.
So think about climate change or environmental risks, which tend to where you can secure short term benefits by causing long term harms. Or think about national debt or unfunded public financial obligations. Over and over again, we're making political choices that hurt children and help other interest holders. And in those calculations, children just aren't represented.
And so, do you see it as a corollary to or following from where we were starting the conversation, which is essentially sort of the structures of the democracy, how things have kind of become unrepresentative? This, in effect, is an example of that in a situation where a different structure would potentially lead to more representative outcomes in a sense.
I don't think you have to buy the entire picture that I was drawing. You know, we're supposed to be a majoritarian democracy. We are, in fact, governed by an elite. I don't think you have to buy that whole worldview to accept the parent proxy voting idea. You could think, well, as long as we've got these majoritarian institutions, they ought to function according to principle, and this is unprincipled. So I mention that because I don't think Steve accepts my co-author accepts my entire worldview with respect to elite governance and the justice of majoritarian arrangements.
Mhm.
So I think there are different roads you can take to thinking that parent proxy voting is a good idea. For me, perfecting democratic arrangements is the road I take to it.
Yeah, interesting. And so I should say and as you know, I'm somewhat skeptical of this idea. And listeners will know sometimes I just play devil's advocate. In this case, I have some questions to say the least.
Yeah.
But want to ask you about one on principle, and then we should also kind of flip to the pragmatic side of it. For me in principle, the idea of saying, well, children are citizens too, they should be equally represented at the ballot box is appealing. It's not clear to me that parent proxy voting accomplishes that, in that it's very hard for me to believe a parent would ever cast a vote for their child in conflict with their own vote. I mean, we can say hypothetically it might happen, but in just in practice, it seems to me it would be very difficult to envision a parent saying, "Well, I'm voting for this candidate," but thinking about what's best for my kid would probably, and with some understanding of my kid's values and priorities, which are necessary to make a policy or political judgment, they'd probably go for this other person. So I'm going to send in canceling votes, one for me, one for the kid. Um, and if you don't have that, then it seems to me you're not actually expanding representation in the spirit of one person, one vote. You're really just saying parents, qua parents, should have, because they have children in their household, parents should have more weight in a sense, which I guess one could also defend, but it is a much harder case to defend, and not the kind of case you were making exactly. So I guess I'd be curious. Do you think it's plausible to say no, no? We can truly ask a parent to discern and to independently discern and vote in our political process for a child as the child?
Well, two responses, Oren. One is parents already in our legal system and our culture represent their children in, for example, medical decisions. I mean, someone has to elect whether an 8-year-old gets a shot or a surgery, and uh, their parents have that authority with limits at the outer boundaries for neglect and abuse. Um, Likewise, someone decides where kids go to school, and that's their parents, again, policed at the outer boundaries. Or likewise, uh, uh, parents decide what religion their children shall have, uh, what community they shall grow up in, what city or state they shall grow up in. In other words, we expect parents to safeguard and defend their children's interests in every other context. By the way, it is not, as you were implying, a relationship where they are trying to sort of channel their children's worldview, right? Sometimes the child will want to go to school A and the parent thinks it's best that they go to school B, or the child won't want to get the shot and the parent thinks it's best that the child gets the shot. So it's really a safeguarding of another person's interests and not just trying to represent them in the sense of being their faithful servant, doing what they would have you do. In fact, a lot of parenting, as you know and as I know, is representing a kid's interests against the kid's preferences. So, no, you can't have more dessert. Yes, you have to eat your vegetables, right? So you're constantly asserting their interests over their preferences. That's just parenthood. Do you think it you apparently don't think it works in the voting context? Do you think it doesn't work in the medical context or doesn't work in the school context? Like, are parents just programmatically bad representatives of their children's interests? Because that's very hard for me to believe. That's very hard to swallow. What we're really doing, Steve and I, is extending the logic of that we use in every other context where we say parents both define and defend their children's interests until their kids reach a point of independent agency. And of course, part of parenting is developing people who are capable of being independent agents. That's the ultimate responsibility, is to make them self-governing people who have a free will and the rational self-control to exercise free will. So that's what we're trying to cultivate, but it's a process. And in every other context, parents define and defend their kids' interests en route to that destination of full agency on the child's part. Why not extend that in the in the voting context? So that's argument number one. I'd love to hear your response. Let me briefly touch on a second argument.
Yeah.
Kids are already counted in the voting pool for purposes of deciding how many um, Congress people a state gets, how many electors it gets in choosing the president, um, legislative districting, census taking. I mean, kids already count for purposes of determining how much political power is being influenced. We just don't let them vote. So their political power is being redistributed to the strangers around them, the non-parents or the parents of other children. So imagine, let me make this more concrete. Imagine you live in a district and you have a spouse and two kids, and your neighbors are a couple with no kids, right? Who is the two kids in your household already count for choosing the number of Congress people and the number of and who gets to be president. They already count for that purpose. Who wields their voting power? The answer is you split it with your neighbors who have no kids. So now the question isn't just, is the parent an adequate representative of their kids? It's, are they a better representative than strangers who happen to live in the same district with them? And then I think it's a slam dunk. Of course, the parents are a better representative.
So the second point actually connects to how I would respond to your first point. But to take the first one first, it seems to me there are two issues with the kind of assessment of preferences. One is that it is certainly true that in the case of sort of raising a child and making decisions for that child, the parent is going against what the child wants constantly, probably most of the time. But it seems to me that in all cases, the parent is acting with an eye toward what the child's long term, what is in the child's long term interest, or at least that is sort of the presumption that we tend to work under. Um, and so I think it's a little different to say, well, you don't want to get a shot, but you're going to get the shot, as opposed to, again, it's interesting to ask, like, okay, well, how do I map that onto the presidential election? So, well, I support candidate A, and I also believe it would be in your long-term interest if candidate A is elected. Though, to be clear, I have absolutely no way to infer or make that judgment or know what your values or interests are, except the fact that it happens to be what I already like. Um, and so I do think and this thing we spend a lot of time on at American Compass, the nature of political judgments is inherently values based. And so I think difficult to make the same kind of determination, um, particularly where, in a sense, we also have the option of not making it. That is, parents make decisions for kids all the time because the decision has to be made. What we have today as the status quo is actually a perfectly workable situation in which it doesn't have to be made, that we're sort of making the case affirmatively to depart from. So the fact that we do the best we can when we have to, I don't know necessarily sells that. The second piece of it, and it actually connects to this point about broader representation in my mind, is that voting is zero sum in a way that, all of these other decisions one makes. It's funny, it actually comes back to our private versus public sphere discussion. For virtually all of those decisions a parent is making within the family are genuinely private sphere decisions. Voting is sort of an inherently public sphere decision, and in assigning a voting right to the parent on behalf of their child, one is actively reducing the power and influence of others. And so to say, essentially, we are going to give this parent more power to assert what we all have to admit is just their own interest, um, not because it has to be done because someone has to make the decision, but merely because we prefer a system where that person has relatively more say than this other person. Um, Again, you could make the case for that system if you thought parents should have more say in the political system than non-parents, but it doesn't seem to me you're actually can say you're doing that because under a sort of principle of one person, one vote, the kid deserves a vote. Um, so we're obviously not going to resolve the situation here, but I think this is a good sort of description of a lot of what people sort of grapple with in principled terms. So I don't know if you have anything else you want to hit on that quickly, and then also want to just talk about pragmatically how this would look.
Sure. I want to be mindful of our time together, which is drawing to a close, and there's a lot of difficult, subtle issues here, issues of framing, among other things. I think if I'm going to pick up just one thread from your rebuttal there, it would be that the status quo is functioning pretty well, and that this would disturb a well-functioning status quo. Um, I don't I think the COVID school shutdowns made vivid something which is true but less obvious otherwise, which is that the status quo is not functioning particularly well. And in fact, we see a pattern of both, in my view, injustice, but also political distortion uh, when it comes to children's interests. And with respect to will parents, the question you seem to be focused on, will parents make different decisions on behalf of their children than they would otherwise make? I'm a little puzzled at that way of framing the question. I think parents already vote with their children in mind for the most part. Their view of what's in their children's best interest affects their voting, but the parents can't vote on behalf of their children, so that interest is proportionally undercounted, right? So um, if parents are saying open up the schools or make sure we don't carry too much national debt, or I'll tell you about a conversation I overheard just the other day. It was really striking for me. I overheard a woman remarking. It was two couples together, and the woman of one of the couples remarked that she's a Democrat, lifelong Democrat. She detests Trump and she would never vote for Trump. But she's also Jewish and she's Zionist. And she feels like a vote for Kamala Harris with the people around Kamala Harris um, might be bad for Israel. And one of her interlocutors, the guy from the other couple, said, um, a vote for Kamala Harris means your Jewish children will face anti Semitism in college. And there was a beat as she absorbed that comment, right? Which is a very stark comment. And she said, I can't disagree with you. I'm conflicted, right? I think that's how parent voting works. That's how parents think about politics. They think about what political decisions mean for their kids. Most parents will do so automatically and reflexively. It won't necessarily change their vote. What it will change is their vote being undercounted, because when they're thinking about politics, they have that particular woman had kids. I saw two or three of them, right? Um, when they're voting for one, but there are three people who aren't represented in that vote. So it really is the perfection of the one person, one vote logic.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. We're going to blow through our time here because we, I still want to get to the pragmatic side of it. But this actually, what you just said raises a really empirical. There's maybe an empirical test in a sense, in that when you were describing, I don't know if the person, for example, had college age kids yet, but it made me think like, well, the college age kid could vote for himself, and actually, I wonder how the college age kid would think about it. And it occurs to me that we could look very easily at the voting choices. It's almost sort of an economic experiment right at the boundary. We don't know what 17-year-olds necessarily would do. Um, we could ask them, but for whatever reason, at least we stipulate that 17-year-olds are too young to be deciding. But we could go look at how a whole bunch of 18-year-olds vote versus how their parents vote. And I wonder what the correlation is, because it seems to me there's some threshold that if you were to say, well, look, if the correlation is above zero point 0.7 or zero point 0.8 or whatever, then we can credibly believe that parents are sort of could exercise political power on behalf of and consistent with the interests of their kids. If um, if the correlation is much lower than that, um, or particularly if you sort of this is a mis metaphor, but in a sense, if you did a one tail analysis and said, well, if 18-year-olds are overwhelmingly progressive, let's say, um, is do conservative parents know that in any
Yeah.
real way? It seems to me if you don't see the correlation between the two sets of voters, then the whole thing falls apart. Would that make any sense as an empirical test or no?
None whatsoever to me. I don't even quite understand that line of thought. I mean, would you say that with medical decisions? Like the way to decide medical decisions for 15-year-olds is to see what 18-year-olds do. And if the parents will do what the 18-year-olds would do, then the parents get to make the medical decision, but otherwise not.
No, well, we have to have someone make the medical decision for the 15-year-old.
Right.
I mean, this goes
Right,
back
because
to
the
the question
alternative,
about
and that goes for voting too. The alternative is that they don't vote at all. They're 23% of the citizen population, but they don't count whatsoever. So I
right,
can acknowledge that parents might be imperfect proxies for their children, but they're sure better than not counting 23% of the population.
right. Well, or another way to say it would be that our status quo assumption is that the preferences of children are more likely to look distributionally representative of everyone who does vote than of parents specifically, which would be another empirical question, I suppose. But let's hit the pragmatic point
Sure.
quickly.
How
I
would
think
it be implemented? Yeah.
well, so the paper does I think, an admirable job sort of describing how it might be implemented, what states can do, and so forth. Really recommend it to folks who want the details. I'll stipulate that it all works as you say it does. My pragmatic question is a political one, which um, is this a good time, given all of America's political challenges, to be pursuing fundamental changes uh, in how our voting works, particularly in ways that make it more complicated, and potentially state by state in ways that affect national political arrangements? Or is that incredibly counterproductive and exactly what conservatives should be arguing against? And that's obviously a very leading question.
Yes.
So I will posit that it strikes me as exactly the opposite of what conservatives should be doing right now. But we'll give you the last word on why this is a constructive and healthy thing for us to be pursuing in in our democracy at this time?
Well, let me just say a quick word about how the pragmatics would work for those who don't want to go look up the article after seeing this video cast or hearing the podcast. Um, One of the things that is an interesting feature of American law is that voting arrangements are almost entirely matters of state law. So each of the 50 states can have different and largely independent voting rules, provided they don't violate certain kinds of federal restrictions, such as the Equal Protection Clause. Um, what that means is that a state that wanted parent proxy voting could implement it with no federal permission. And they could implement it not only for state elections, but also for federal elections. So the way the president and Congress people get elected um, on the federal level could be decided by individual states, and the states could differ from one another. So maybe Massachusetts, where you are now, will agree with you, and Virginia, where I am now, will agree with me. They're perfectly free to have independent policies in that regard. And I think the way it would work pragmatically is that you would have to, states already have, let's start with this, states already have very good information about how many kids there are and who they belong to. They need that information for, um, they gather it on birth certificates and social security records and custody disputes and the like. And they need that information in order to make all sorts of legal decisions, like who can open a bank account for who, or who's in charge of school enrollment, or who gets to make a medical decision. So the information is there in state databases. Um, uh, the thing to do would be to add it to the voting rolls in advance so that parents register as proxy voters on behalf of their children, guardians of the mentally incompetent uh, register as proxy voters on behalf of those whose care they're charged with. Um, and, and so you have an orderly process for determining who votes for who. Actually, the most challenging aspect of it is that you will have multiple proxies in many cases. If there's a married couple, both of whom have equal custody of their children, they both have a right to vote on behalf of their children. They have a right to vote as proxies, and they might disagree with one another. Uh, so, how do you manage that? And I think the only practical way to do it is fractional voting. So, if I go to vote for candidate one on behalf of myself, and let's say I have one child, on behalf of my one child, my vote counts for one and a half. And this could be tabulated and calculated automatically by computers. You just fill in some bubbles showing that I am a voter with one child, and there are two people, namely my spouse, who also has custody of that child. And she would do the same. And our family of three, it's actually a family of four, I'm using this hypothetically, our family of three would cast three votes as a family. So the math would work out, but my individual voting might be one and a half, and hers would be one and a half. So um, all of this is implementable on a pragmatic level, and again, crucially, is a matter of state decision, and it doesn't require a sometimes dysfunctional federal government to make any decision whatsoever. To answer
So,
your second question about whether this is desirable in light of how fractious our country is right now, um, I think that many of the issues besetting our country today um, involve the interests of children in important ways, and it's a deep injustice not to include those children in the decision. Um, Many decisions, for example, about the educational sphere uh, or about gender disputes, uh, many of them involve the kind of legal and cultural world in which we bring up children, and um, the interests of the children should be heard in those cultural disputes. As to it being divisive, I guess I don't share your intuition that it's more divisive than all the other things about which our country's divided. Actually, I've been quite struck as I've gone around different podcasts and different audiences talking about this idea that there are many people on the left who endorse it and many people on the right who oppose it, and vice versa. And so, if anything, it's in interesting ways creating new partnerships. I have not seen a consistent left right pattern. In fact, the idea was endorsed both by Cornel West and J.D. Vance if that is any indication. And you and I are disagreeing about it, and we're largely aligned on other issues. So I don't think it's particularly divisive. I will add, I guess, just one final thought on this score. If you search the archives, you will find a letter, I believe, from John Adams, um, in response to the person he was writing to who had proposed changing the voting rules in some way. I think it was to allow people without property to vote. And John Adams said, if you open this can of worms, who knows what will come out of it? It might even lead to women voting. And let me just say, that letter of John Adams has not aged well. And I think excluding citizens from the voting rolls because of fear that it will open up chaos will also not age well.
Well, we will leave things there then. Professor Josh Kleinfeld, thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Oren. This was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass podcast.